Casablanca is one of the most revered films in all of cinema. The 1943 film, directed by Michael Curtiz, has long been seen as pretentious, but when looked at under a critical lens, there's a lot to love about this movie, the methods that it uses, and the way it discusses love, sacrifice, and global politics. We'll discuss all this and more coming up next. How's it going, everybody? My name is Nate, and welcome back to Culture Colosseum. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about one of my favorite movies, 1943's Casablanca. But before we get into that, be sure to follow us on all our social media, Instagram, Facebook, all the works, and be sure to follow Creative Source Studios and all those as well to see what we're doing outside of Culture Colosseum. And without further ado, where to begin with this film? Because this film over the years has kind of developed a stigma around it, which is that this is the favorite film of pretentious people who sit around smoking cigars and drinking sherry and talking about the cinema. But really, if you look at it, this is kind of a universal story, and there's really a lot to love if you can get over the fact that yes, it's in black and white, and it's not, an action thriller in the way we would think about a modern action thriller. But I've broken it down. I have an ordered list of all the things I want to talk about. The first thing I really think we need to go over is the plot, which is kind of obviously one of my favorite parts of the movie. And specifically, the first thing I want to talk about is Rick's character progression. When we meet Rick, he is playing chess in the back by himself, drinking and smoking a cigarette. And this is kind of the perfect introduction for his character, because Rick, as we'll talk about later, is very much an isolationist. Later on, Sidney Greenstreet's character, Ferrari, even calls him out for it. He says it's no longer a practical policy. But Rick, at the beginning of this film, very much is an isolationist. Rick wants to be left alone, which is even more evident in his interactions with Ugarte, Peter Lorre's character, who shows up, who he basically completely dismisses. He tells him he's a parasite. He doesn't care about him. He doesn't even care enough to hate him. And then we see a very kind of present shift, obviously, once Ilsa reappears. Before that, we have this wonderful scene where Rick meets with Major Strasser and Captain Reynaud, who's my favorite character in the whole movie, where they're sitting there and they're talking, and Strasser is like, "Oh, we know who you are. We know what you did. Like, you ran guns to Ethiopia. You were this freedom fighter." But we've seen that Rick is now this isolationist. Like, this is he wants to be left alone. He's not in the fight anymore. So that kind of perfectly plants this question that the filmmakers then answer. Why is Rick this way? And they kind of enhance it even more by when Strasser hands him the dossier and he's like flipping through it. His questions aren't like, where did you get this information? Like, what are you gonna do with it? He turns to Strasser and he asks them, are my eyes really brown? He's making jabs at them, even though presumably they could lock him up, because obviously his activities are not in line with the policies that they want to enforce. And that's Rick's isolationism is even more enforced by the rest of that interaction, where, as Renault puts it, Rick is completely neutral about everything, where they start asking him all these questions like, are you one of those people who can't imagine us in your beloved Paris? And he's like, well, it's not particularly my beloved Paris. Could you imagine us in London? He says, well, when you get there, ask me. So Rick is this isolationist. He does not care. And all of that gets completely thrown out of whack once Ilsa shows up. When Ilsa shows up, Rick breaks every single one of his rules. He immediately starts ordering drinks for that table. He's interacting with customers. He's drinking with customers, which is, as Renault puts it, another precedent has been broken. Uh, and it begins building, another question. Okay, well, now Rick has very evidently shifted. Why is that a thing? And as we'll learn in the next scene, or in the next little bit with the Paris montage, as he's waiting for Ilsa to come back, we learn why Rick is that way, because he was, abandoned at the train platform. Uh, he believes that Ilsa was playing him because he suggests that she's, sleeping around. Uh, and you even see him regret that in the scene afterwards, where he's like, I'm sorry, I was in no condition to receive you last night, which isn't that does not excuse that, but you can see that he obviously knows that they got off on the wrong foot, and that maybe he's done something wrong, and that maybe there's something he needs to salvage. And that continues through the rest of the film, and even right up towards the end, where we have that moment where Ilsa comes back for the letter. She threatens him with a gun, um, and then they kind of get back what they had, and then at the end of the movie, he lets her go because that's what he has to do. Like, he has gone from only doing what's good for him at the beginning, and now he's doing what he knows he needs to do because Ilsa is what keeps Laszlo going. So he knows he needs to send her away with Laszlo. And not only that, but he has now involved himself in, you know, aiding and abetting a fugitive from the government, which is obviously a crime. Doesn't mean that it's wrong in this case, but it's still, he's no longer an isolationist. He's now sticking his neck out for the cause. And we see even at the end of the film that Renault's like, oh, I hear there's a free French garrison over in Brazzaville. And he's like, you still owe me this money. He's like, well, that should pay our expenses. And presumably Rick is now a changed man. He goes and gets back in the fight. And this really ties into another thing I wanted to talk about, which is the love story between Rick and Ilsa, and how it discusses love and sacrifice, and how, you know, the question is really raised. Did Rick and Ilsa really love each other? And I believe yes, for a time they did. And I believe at the end, Rick still loves Ilsa. And he loves her so much that he realizes he has to make that sacrifice and do not only what's good for, her, or what's good for him, but what's good for the world and what's going to keep her safe, which is send her away with Laszlo on the plane. And then one more thing I did want to note about the plot before I move on is the usage of the backdrop of World War II, um, which was very topical at the time. Obviously, the United States enters World War II in 1941 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and this film came out 2 years later. It's just interesting to see how the backdrop of the war is used to illustrate the emotions of the characters, because the film takes place before Pearl Harbor. America is very much not involved in the war, and we're going to get into that a little later on when I talk about the use of allegory in this film. And another thing I wanted to mention, which doesn't really fit into, which kind of fits into this category, is a moment in the film which is personally one of my favorites, that was actually unscripted. And a lot of people know about this, but some people don't. There's a moment in the film where Major Strasser and the rest of the Germans are singing the anthem of the Reich. And they're being loud and raucous. And we've seen earlier in the film when, I believe it's in Italian and a German, or an Italian and a Frenchman. Two of these two soldiers get into it at the bar, and they start going at each other. And Rick shows up and he pulls them apart, and he's like, either lay off the politics or get out. And when they start singing, Rick is talking to Laszlo, and Laszlo, upon hearing it, immediately runs downstairs from Rick's office, goes up to the house band, and is like, "Play La Marseillaise," which is the national anthem of France. Uh, and the band is like, "Do we want to do that?" Because they know Rick is not a big fan of politics, but he gives them his little nod, and they start playing, and Laszlo starts singing, and the rest of the club stands up, which was obviously scripted. But what was not scripted was the reaction of the actress who plays Yvonne, who I believe her name is Madeline LeBlanc, I think, or LeBeau. I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's a very famous shot of her, the single tear rolling down her cheek, because she was a French expatriate when this film was being made, and they did not know what the fate of their country was going to be after the war. So that was a very real, unscripted reaction to that scene, and they saw it and they were like, "That's got to be in this movie," um, which is just kind of an interesting piece of trivia, but it does kind of tie into how the backdrop of the war uh, affects the progression of the characters. Um, and then I do want to next. I want to talk about a couple of technical elements. Um, Firstly, a lot of people don't like this movie because it's in black and white, which is understandable. I have grown up in an age of color television and film. Uh, However, the use of lighting in this film is remarkably not lost due to the black and white, and it's beautiful. There are some scenes, especially what immediately comes to mind is the scene where Rick is waiting for Ilsa to come back after the first night, where he's drinking and Sam is playing the piano. The lighting in that scene is just so perfect. And then especially when Ilsa comes back, she's perfectly illuminated and he's, kind of half in the shadow, kind of symbolizing his character. It's really it's really very good, and it's not, it's not just like, "Oh, throw a light over there, it's fine." There was very obviously a lot of thought put into this, especially because you couldn't tell what color things were. So you had to you couldn't use, well, this color represents this and this color represents this. You had to just be like light and dark, and that's how we're going to do it. So the next thing I want to talk about is the use of music, and notably the fact that while the film does have a soundtrack composed by Max Steiner, it doesn't really feature leitmotif in the way that you're used to thinking about it. Like, for instance, in the Lord of the Rings soundtrack by Howard Shore, you have like the Shire theme, and you have you know, a theme for the orcs or a theme for Sauron. In this movie, you really have only one theme, and that theme is actually a song that already existed called "As Time Goes By," which is used as Rick and Ilsa's love theme. And despite the fact that it was a song that already existed, they work it into the orchestration so beautifully to represent their love theme that, like, especially, during parts where, Sam isn't even playing, you can still hear it in the orchestration. Like, even right at the end of the film at the finale, you can still hear it as he's watching Ilsa leave, because it still represents, like, that love. It's still there even though they're going to be separated again. So I just wanted to mention that because it really is an interesting use of music that already exists, almost like a jukebox musical. But obviously, this is not really a musical. It's just an interesting use of music, and it really kind of shows how creative you had to be back then, because they did not have the large scale sweeping scores that we have today for our films. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is uh, Casablanca as an allegory for global politics. So a lot of people have made this comparison, and it does work to a certain extent. I don't think it holds water all the way, but it's certainly there is credence to it. It's said that the movie is supposed to be kind of an allegory for America becoming involved in World War II. So obviously Rick is isolationist America. Laszlo would represent the European resistance to the expansion of fascism. Uh, Renault is Vichy France, or just France, because he does eventually switch sides at the end of the film. And then Major Strasser would obviously be Germany. Um, the only one that kind of doesn't work, at least in my mind, and I have a semi-limited knowledge of World War II, is Ilsa, because Ilsa is from Norway. To my knowledge, Norway is not somewhere that America was closely entangled with prior to World War II, but it does kind of it makes sense to me in a way. Just the only thing that doesn't work for me is Ilsa, but the rest of the characters and the way they interact really does kind of reflect global politics at the time, because you have, you know, the isolationist Americans, the European resistance in Laszlo, Strasser as Germany, and then Renault as France, who kind of goes either way. He even says, I'll go wherever the prevailing wind is from, and right now the prevailing wind happens to be from Vichy. So it works on a level because obviously, like I talked about, Rick comes out of isolation and becomes an idealist again to save Ilsa and help Laszlo. So the only thing that I can't figure out is Ilsa. If you would like to comment that down below and enlighten me as to what I'm missing here, um, that would be wonderful. But I still think it works nonetheless, even if you are missing certain pieces like I am. That, it makes sense how these characters interact. Uh, Renault changing sides at the end, and Rick coming out of isolation to fight, uh, to help Laszlo, and to not even necessarily fighting at Strasser, just to help Laszlo, because he knows in his heart that what Laszlo is doing is right. Uh, so I just think that's kind of an interesting way to look at this film. Um, and finally, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of this film on pop culture. Um, the film is not something that it's not like a quippy Marvel film where you just go around like, quoting lines from it. But there are a few lines that have become deeply ingrained in pop culture. Here's looking at you, kid, particularly is the first one I think of. Play it again, Sam. You know, lines like that have become really deeply ingrained in pop culture. It was part of a Disney ride for the longest time at Hollywood Studios. Casablanca was part of the Great Movie Ride. You could see the scene where Rick sends Ilsa away with Laszlo, uh, and I think that really says a lot about how much this film means because of just its staying power. Like I said, it came out in 1943. We are now in 2020. I'm not very good at math, but that's a pretty long time. You know, it's almost 80, I believe. It's 77, I think. So it really shows just how, even though people don't think, oh yeah, Casablanca is a great piece of pop culture. I sit down and watch that all the time. No, but it's still culturally relevant because really, even when you take away the allegory, it's a story that a lot of people can relate to because just the characters are relatable. Everyone's, not to overly simplify, but everybody's had that bad breakup where they just, well, I don't want to care about anybody anymore. They just want to isolate themselves. And then they meet that person who brings them back into the world and is like, look, look what you have to do. Like, become an idealist again. It's really a universal story with very relatable characters. You just have to get over the pretentious part of it. There are some people that are very pretentious about this film. Do I think this is the greatest movie ever made? Possibly. Am I gonna go out and, you know, yell at people about it? No. If you ask me if I think it is, I will say yes, but I'm not gonna rant about it. I don't think it's high art. I think it could be high art if you wanted to look at it like that, but I really don't think it deserves this pretentious nature that has been kind of forced upon it over the years. And really, that's my whole point here. People see a movie that's, in black and white and about semi dark topics and just go, oh, that's not for me. I can't watch that. Because, we live in an age of movies that are very bright and very colorful and very fun. And it just goes to show that these movies aren't inaccessible. These are universal stories that can be appreciated by everyone. You just have to learn to look past a couple of things. And with that said, that's all we have for you today. Let me know in the comments what your favorite part of the movie was and what you think about both the allegory aspect of this film and the pretentious nature that it's been given over the years. Does it really deserve it? That said, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.